You have a question? Okay, that's okay too. Okay, so we're gonna move on to landscape ecology, very brief, so a brief overview, and a little bit of policy. And again, you already had these reminders. Um, this is also on your question set, so why don't you take a moment to think about it. Hopefully you, at bare minimum, know the four grazing factors, which was from the beginning of the semester. Oh, wow. Is that a lot? Oh, okay. Well, oh, I see. Okay. You do. Yeah. Good. Glad you're reading. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's okay. Some people laughed. Okay, I just laughed them. Okay, we'll continue this question, but what are the four grazing factors? Okay, great. The second one. Great. Fourth one. That's the same. Intensity, that's number one. Not that you really need to know. What's the last one? Yes, perfect. All fun.
It's all
Frequency is how often you put them on, and timing is when you put them on. So hopefully you guys can give example of each, but maybe you guys should talk with each other if you can. You can have another minute or two. Huh?
Depending on you're trying to start, probably to like where you got to go see yeah, understanding. Sure.
Okay, how can intensity be used?
high intensity, low duration to have house. So for plants, they would normally plant, or if you're trying to get rid of dirt or something like that.
Yes, good. How about duration, selectivity, not max or chi?
You gotta give it enough time to progress the rotation from grading every 3 days is good. All right. And then
Yes. You want to add something?
or measure
Yeah, maybe.
remove the cows before the grass turns white. It still has to be lush.
Yeah, so you want to think about overgrazing. The other thing is this part of it, selectivity. So the longer you leave cattle in an area, the less selective they will be, because the less forage there is, and they're going to have to eat stuff they don't like to eat, because they have feeding preferences just like we do. And so you can force them to eat really shitty food if you leave them in there for a really long time. If you leave them in there for a very short time, they are going to target, again, what we call ice cream plants, which are the tastiest things. Okay, timing. Keith? Yes, so thinking about when is the best time to put them out for either animal gains or to manage for different management factors is important. So peak growth is important for nutrition and forage. Early in the season, there's a lot of nutrition. And at certain times of the year, like when annual grasses start to bolt, but perennial grasses hasn't, that's a great time for targeted grazing. Sorry if that was what you're about to say. So that timing, frequency.
Um, I just had it.
It's okay.
Uh, so like in peak growing season, you're able to rotate short and within shorter spans, things grow back quicker, so you can revisit more. You're like trying to hit this target of like the most growth nutrients that you cannot put.
Yeah, definitely. In that context, it's to maximize animal gains. And so that's definitely possible. Another reason you might manipulate frequency is to hit the same spot over and over to limit invasion or to reduce a population of a specific species that you're concerned about. And we do that a lot for like yellow star thistle, for example. Great. Glad we all know the 4 grazing factors. So landscape ecology is a big topic, but we're just going to cover a few topics. We're just going to briefly go over it. So this is the study of spatial patterns and ecological processes and how ecological processes affect spatial patterns. Spatial scales can change depending on your perspective. And so there are global landscapes, there are continental landscapes, there are regional landscapes. And you can kind of see that how you look at a patch in the bottom right-hand corner depends on kind of how you look at the edges. It also depends on the size of the organism. Cows will view things very differently than an insect will. Which reminds me, there was a really cool comment. Adam Cantor, who works at the Wiyot tribe, says that the Wiyot used to use fire to herd grasshoppers into trenches to capture for eating. Thanks for sharing, Adam. Back to landscape ecology. So some important things to think about when you're thinking about landscape factors is patch size, of course. We talked a little bit about, well, Ernesto will have hopefully talked a little bit about this when he went over some theory. Patch connectivity. We're going to talk a little bit more about this next. Connectivity of ecosystem services, which is also related to patch connectivity, also related to patch size. Surrounding land use. Edge effects is a very important concept that we'll talk about. And then also thinking about the socioeconomic political landscapes is really important, which people don't often think about. Ecology doesn't have the same socio-ecological or political boundaries or geopolitical boundaries that counties and countries and states do. And thinking about how to work across those landscapes are also important to think about because resources may differ from one side to another or from one country to another. There's joint management of areas along the US-Canada border with Great Lakes and Glacier National Park and whatever it's called on the other side, Waterloo, I think. And down in Tijuana, there's also joint management in the border areas between Mexico and the US. And those ecosystems are still one ecosystem. They're just separated by some arbitrary wall and geopolitical boundary. Other things to think about is species dispersal and how things can move and transport across the landscape, as well as how global change factors will affect a lot of these different things. So, well, first off, let's think about why is patch size important in rangeland ecology? Anyone know why?
Scale.
Partially. Anyone else?
There's 4 different organisms, and like that side
Yeah, so larger patch sizes can support more organisms of the same population. It can also support higher species richness, typically, or higher diversity of an area. And so if you have large patch sizes, you typically have more species diversity. Um, and here you might just have circles and squares or whatever. And so you have more diversity, you have more potential propagule pressure to exert onto the landscape. Seeds. So the larger the area, the larger the population, and the more seeds it can produce and push out to surrounding landscapes. Edge effects is a pretty important concept. And it is essentially the interface between two distinct ecotones or habitats or ecosystems, whatever you want to call them, or the interface between, again, these are just basically two different types of habitats, urban and degraded. Uh, and the edge effect is strongest, of course, at the very edge, and then it weakens as you go further out. Um, Edge effects can be major boundaries for specific dispersal mechanisms. Based on changing abiotic and biotic conditions. It can also be a local hotspot for diversity because it sometimes can be more heterogeneous than other areas. And so if we look at the slide here and we look at the edge of the wooded corridor and the grassland, you might expect there to be heterogeneity there because there are trees and there's also grasses and forbs and whatever else is in a grassland. And so that area is going to be diverse in habitat structure. And because of that, it's going to be diverse in species as well. But it also causes major management issues, especially in rangelands that have issues with invasion, which are almost all rangelands. And that's because the more edge you have, the more area you have for invasive species or species of concern to come in. So you can see the area or the perimeter of this is, I don't really know, let's just say 4 meters. And then the perimeter of this is 2 meters. And so there's a lot more space for propagules to come in at the edges. And this would be even worse if the habitat was fragmented with a road, for example. And then you have these 4 meters, but then you have these additional 2 meters or whatever this is. And so that is more pressure for the remnant habitat or the reference or whatever is there. And there's propagule pressure potentially coming in from all ends. And typically these propagules coming in are undesirable species. Any questions? Okay, hold your peace. So this is also why we have this type of concept in ecological management, especially in rangelands, about defending and growing the core. Because oftentimes the core is what you want to protect. And so in this case, you might think about invasive species or likely invasive species. And so you can see that we have a habitat that has low annual grass cover. Let's just say that's native grass cover or whatever, native habitat. And the interior of that, you can see that there's now starting to be invasion. And so if we wanted to really prioritize and think about where we manage, we really should think about prioritize. If we had two different landscapes that we could choose from, we would want to choose this one first off, prioritize, because it has a good core, and that's something that you could potentially treat and grow. And so here you would really want to treat that early on, ideally, to really think about and manage that issue and then continue monitoring to ensure that issue doesn't arise and worsen over time. On the right-hand side is a different scenario, which is lower priority for management, but a lot of times that's all you have left. You're in a matrix of a highly degraded rangeland, and then you have a couple good spots in there. In this case, you can't manage everything from all sides. You don't have enough money, you don't have enough time. And so what you really need to do is try to grow the core so that it can be more continuous and stronger. And so here you might want to attack the grid like this right there. And connect those two, like connect those points and create a stronger interior core for native species to, or other species, desirable species to sustain and populate. Any questions? So again, spatial scales matter, and thinking about different scales is really important. So like a global scale, we might think about where are the biodiversity hotspots and where are key threats. And as you zoom down, you might think about something more local. And so like, for example, when we're thinking about rangelands, we might think about where are all the rangelands in the world? Which ones are, I mean, important is subjective, but which ones are quote unquote important to protect and why and how? And typically that involves a cost benefit analysis. And then we can zoom down a lot apparently to the watershed level, and think about how do we manage for things in this watershed. Typically, people like to collect and maintain genetic diversity within a watershed. That's kind of the I won't get to those complications. But watersheds are another discrete unit that people typically use because the water comes from the top and it drains out at the bottom, and propagules and other things flow from the top of the watershed down to the other areas in the tributaries. And then you have an ecosystem within a watershed, and you can think about, well, how are we going to manage this specific ecosystem, not this landscape? What type of particular management practices will be beneficial for the plant communities, the animals, the wildlife, as well as ecosystem services? And then you might think at a very small scale, like at the soil level. And then you might think about how might the soil need to be managed or enhanced in order to properly function or quote unquote properly function or maintain the benefits that we've experienced over time. And so in some cases, you might need a fire, for example. Maybe you need some harvesting of something, for example. It could be anything, depending on the place, because everything depends. Yeah. Things slow down from the top of the watershed to the bottom of the watershed. And so that's why people often consider it one discrete unit when thinking about propagules or like genetic diversity, because the genes at the top are in seeds, right? And those seeds float down the river into the little streams, brooks, whatever, rills. And then does that make sense kind of?
Yeah,
That's right.
but yes, that is it.
Okay. So there are a few geometric principles that we think about in landscape ecology related to nature reserves, for better or worse. And so that might be how big a patch is or how small it is, whether you have one large patch versus several small patches, close versus dispersed. You can see which is better and worse on the figure. Clustered versus online, which is this is from 1975. Connected versus unconnected, and round versus elongated. And so most of these relate to minimizing the better ones, minimizing edge effects, and maximizing connectivity. That's generally what is making it quote unquote better. So these are some of these better or worse to betters examples and kind of like what happens. And so you might want to increase habitat cover. So you might want to make new patches. When you make those patches, you want to make sure they're close to each other. You might have limited resources. So maybe you can't make them perfectly next to each other. And maybe you make something that they call stepping stones as a little jumping point, also known as sometimes known as applied nucleation, or islands, habitat islands that might spread and merge one day, ideally. And so there's a lot of more recent work on that related to the term applied nucleation. Um, Ecological corridors are basically creating a habitat corridor. You have more money than stepping stones. You actually just connect the habitat, and that's best. Improving the patch or shape or size. Again, you can see that it went from this weird, like, I don't know, really messy U, like someone wrote, anyways, to a circle that has less perimeter to area ratio, so less edge, establishing buffer zones, increasing habitat permeability. So in that case, C, Habitat permeability could mean like it is two patches in a concrete in a concrete jungle, and finding a way to allow for spread of species between two large skyscrapers, for example, is thinking about habitat permeability. There's a lot of other ways to think about habitat permeability, but that's one of the most common things these days. Removing barriers to biotic and abiotic flows, a dam, great example. A fence, another example, but that doesn't usually stop abiotic flows. And so removing barriers can be important sometimes. Large walls and structures, like a land dam, basically. So there are pros and cons of habitat connectivity. Mostly pros, but there are cons pros typically outweigh the cons, but it's important to consider. So pros is increased dispersal, increased gene flow. Increased gene flow means increased gene diversity. Increased gene diversity typically means a population is healthier and more resilient to disturbances like climate or other human-caused disturbances. And also increased in access to needed resources over space and time, and increased pollination. Predation could increase if you are trying to protect a particular species. Predation could increase, which could be a pro if that is your goal. For some reason, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to have more predation, actually. So that could be a pro, but in the context of livestock production, that could be a con. Pathogen spread, also important to consider. When there's more habitat connectivity, there's greater flow of everything, including pathogens. Increased invader spread for the same reasons. If there is a lot of habitat permeability and connectivity, that's going to be an issue. Decreased connectivity could also increase disturbance over time. There's more areas that could experience disturbances. And then you might have issues with synchronizing population function fluctuations across patches, resulting in mismatches with symbiotic species over time that are well adapted to certain species. And then maybe that patch doesn't do well that year and they die off. And then these symbionts, whatever they are looking for those that population at that time of year. And the other ones are out of sync and they're no longer able to use it. And that can cause issues as well. Connected patches typically in reviews have been found to usually have higher plant diversity and richness, even in the same total area, even with the same amount of edge. As long as they're connected, they typically do better.
What is that?
It's a forest. It's in a log pole pines. I think in that area over there in Georgia and South Carolina. But it's on the border. But yeah, that's in South Carolina. Oh wait, we already did this one. So sociopolitical landscapes are also important to think about. Rangelands, like I already mentioned before, encompass and span geopolitical borders. And so it's important to understand social and political landscapes around rangeland management due to edge effects, funding, political pressure, community pressure, all have a really important role in rangeland management, even though ecologists don't always necessarily consider them. Political landscapes are also particularly important to navigate public perception, which can limit management activities and funding, or can be an avenue for increased support and labor and volunteers. Or they could protest you and they could limit what you can do. You could be limited in prescribed fire. You could be limited in pesticide application. You could be limited in where or how you graze, or really anything that the public doesn't agree with you on. So it's really important to have good public outreach and education and communication. Any questions? No?
Have you written like their public perception of what you
Yeah, I mean, not me in particular because I don't really do project. I haven't done project management in like 10 years now. But where I study restoration sites, I do interviews with the practitioners and I ask this question. In some areas they do have, like the Mid Peninsula Open Space District used to have a lot of issues with their surrounding neighbors and using fire. But then they started a fire education outreach program. And over 5 years, they've been able to build really important support that now allow them to do prescribed fire, but also garners donations to help support that work now. So I don't really know if that answers your question or not. Okay. In other areas like where I've worked, you can't use like herbicide sometimes. In other areas, grazing is sometimes viewed negatively when it's actually very important for the ecosystem. So, like for example, where I work in Red Bluff, there's this really beautiful foreland, and it is grazed year round continuously, and it has really the most spectacular wildflower blooms like aside from a carrizo plain that I've ever seen, like miles and miles of flowers. And then there's also these really great grazing exposures. Someone had the foresight to set up like 10 years ago that I'm monitoring this year. And they are basically completely overgrown with like 5 species of annual grasses, and not at all beautiful. And so that can be really important because, like, for example, I often see like people say, which that's okay because they don't know. I used to have the same opinion a lot of times too, that grazing just is flat out bad for management and for biodiversity, which it isn't. And so that is where I think there's a lot of issue right now, especially in our grasslands and with our legislation. To help answer your question more. So we're just going to briefly cover some legislation, or just go over some. The Multiple Use Act of 1960 was important U.S. rangeland legislation. It established policy and purpose for the National Forest Service to provide multiple use and sustained yield of all products. So that means any area has to support multiple products or ecosystem functions and services, and also has to be sustainable. So it's not, in this case of rangeland, it's not causing overgrazing and erosion on public property. There is NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, that directs all federal agencies to consider and report potential environmental impacts of proposed federal actions and establish a council on environmental quality. And so any work, construction, even land management these days that takes place in public lands, federal lands, that could affect any type of anything in the environment requires a NEPA. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, a very important act. It protects animals and plant species currently endangered of extinction and those that may become endangered or extinct in the foreseeable future. It also provides conservation of ecosystems that upon which threatened and endangered species of fish, wildlife, and plants depend on, both through federal action and through encouraging state-specific programs. A lot of rangelands support endangered and threatened species, and so the Endangered Species Act, even though it is controversial for different reasons for different people, is very important for actually maintaining and protecting rangeland habitats from from development specifically. There's the Forest and Range Renewable Resources Planning Act of 1974, which establishes a public land policy and guidelines for management, protection, and development that has a goal of enhancing public lands. So again, limiting and promoting sustainability, so to speak, and limiting degradation of resources. The Forest Management Act of 1976 amended the original Forest Act of 1974 that required the Department of Agriculture to assess forest lands and rangelands to develop a management program based on multiple use and sustainable yield practices. And so before, they just had a mandate to do that. Now they had to write a written plan on how that was going to be achieved. There is the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, which requires that public lands be managed in a way that protects the quality of scientific, scenic, historic, ecological, environmental, air, atmospheric, water resources, and archaeological values. So that is much more specific and much more detailed. And so now it's not just multiple use. It has to be protected for all of these different things. Again, scientific, scenic, historical, ecological, environmental, archaeological, water, and air. Those all have to be preserved and protected with any management that's being undertaken on public lands. It also states that there should be room for outdoor recreation and human occupancy and use. And so again, further mandating that multiple use. And then there was the Public Rangelands Improvement Act of 1978, which establishes and reaffirms national policies and commitment to inventorying and identifying current public rangelands, their conditions, the trends, and conducting inventories of these areas so we have a baseline for future management. This is also where we started to think about management of wild horses and burros that are damaging to, well, cause a lot of overgrazing and soil erosion. Any questions on boring stuff? So California also has some important rangeland legislation. We'll just go through a few Acts 3 today that are relatively important. The Williamson Act is a very important act, also known as the California Land Conservation Act of 1965. And this enables protection of important agricultural and rangeland resources. It's essentially a fancy conservation easement. It promotes partnerships between private landowners and local governments to designate and protect important rangeland habitats from land conversion. It greatly reduces property tax, and that is kind of where the saving costs come in to help boost net profit. Unlike some of the other conservation easements, like the ones you guys learned about from malt and from, I think it was mainly from malt, these are time bound. So these are not indefinite. They don't roll over to the next generation. Oh, I mean, they're time bound, so they could roll over to the next owner, but it is a time period, typically 20 years. It must be renewed periodically at the county level. And so there's patchwork. I don't know if implementation and rules can vary by local counties and political structures and viewpoints. This is California legislation, but it is enacted by counties, not by the state. And so different in Humboldt County, Wendy says the Williamson Act is 10 years, not 20. But implementation can vary by local counties and political structures. So different counties will have different amount of funding set aside for the Williamson Act. They will qualify different open spaces for the Williamson Act. There has been amendments since 1965. And so some people are very strict in just crop production. A lot of people are very open to considering rangelands and that are actively grazed. And then there are also new amendments that allow for considerations. Oh, I have amendments that allow for considerations of open spaces like parks and nature reserves to be qualified for these tax reductions. Yeah.
Are there any tax conservation?
Yes, property tax. That's generally where the main so I mean, you get a lump sum, not for this one. You get a lump sum for like those conservation easement in perpetuity, but you also do get tax breaks, property tax breaks.
Okay. So there's some.
Well, I don't know the top property tax breaks off the top of my head, and it all depends because all easements, depending on who's administering them and the contract, are different. This is a very, very specific easement program offered only through the county, whereas there are a lot of easement programs that are offered through nonprofits that are brokered through nonprofits, but still managed ultimately by the state. No, they can't. Well, I assume they can't do both, but get the rangeland trust. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so some things you can, but I think it's also on a case by case and agency basis. And the California Rangeland Trust is a really great organization, and they're really open to getting as many properties enrolled as possible. But not every agency is always as open. There's conflicts between depending on the special interest of that agency. Yes, but the California Rangeland Trust is very exclusive, so to speak. Not exclusive, but they only have so much time and labor, and a lot of people want to be in be sort of like a part of their trust now. And so I think from what I hear, there's a big waiting line. Which there could be also for the Williamson Act, depending on where you are. Okay, we only have 2 more slides, so we're gonna try to get through this. The Rangeland Grazing Land and Grassland Protection Act of 2002. This is California rangeland legislation again. This is generally just to prevent conversion of rangelands, grazing lands, and grasslands to non-agricultural uses. So that means development, essentially. Because you can have grazing and recreation on grasslands at the same time, for example. It's to protect the long-term sustainability of livestock grazing, or maybe that's not the right term, but that's the term they use in the bill. But it's more to protect the long-term, ability to have livestock grazing, because we need open space to do so. It's also to ensure continued wildlife, water quality, watershed, and open space benefits from livestock grazing. And this is legislation that was pushed through in partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Board, WCB. They are very big, important funders and policy advocates across our state. A more recent policy that was passed was SB 675, which is using prescribed grazing to help with wildfire prevention. This is hopefully used to also help prevent rangelands, grazing lands, and grasslands from being converted to non-agricultural uses. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I didn't update these bullets. So ignore the bullets. But this is essentially used to help this is just passed last year. And so this is a Senate bill. That's what S stands for, Senate, and A stands for Assembly. That is used to hopefully incentivize and make it easier for people to utilize livestock grazing on landscapes, especially for fuel reductions. And so before there was a lot more permitting, and this Senate bill is essentially meant to help reduce permitting, logistics, and potential costs associated with for the leasing. Oftentimes with prescribed grazings, you actually pay the leasee to come out. And before, there were a lot of legal complications of exactly how funds could be administered and how we could use that to protect from wildfire. This is also help build public or combat public perception of what grazing is used for, or how it might not have use for ecological management. But grazing is very important for fire management and for thatch and fuel reduction across the state. We'll skip this. Very, very long question. Yeah. Well, the last question said is very integrated. So that's it. Bye. I have office hours at 3:30. So if you need anything, come on by.